Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, the minister here at Westminster Church and moderator of today's forum with Chris Blattman. We are pleased to get things started with an opening musical performance today by the Ukrainian Village Band. And their UVB is what they're known locally as. They've been performing around the Twin Cities and the Upper Midwest for 15 years, and the repertoire includes, as we will hear, I suspect, traditional and modern Ukrainian music, as well as their own take on popular international rock and pop tunes. I don't know what you're going to play, but it sounds like it's going to be great. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, UVB has focused on sharing Ukrainian culture across the state and raising money to support Ukraine through benefit performances. Please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum the Ukrainian Village Band.
Червона ружа ще не зів'яла, вона й не думала зів'ять. Наша любов ще не пропала, вона повернеться назад. Наша любов ще не пропала, вона повернеться назад. Візьму я леду двохметрову, нехай повіє вітерець. На біле личко, на чорні брови, моїй любові вже кінець. На біле личко, на чорні брови, моїй любові вже кінець. А мама двері зачиняє і промовляє такі слова. Куди ж ти їдеш, її лишаєш, вона зів'яне, як трава. Куди ж ти їдеш, її лишаєш, вона зів'яне, як трава. Не зачиняйте, мамо, двері, нехай повіє вітерець. На біле личко, на чорні брови, моїй любові вже кінець. На біле личко, на чорні брови, моїй любові вже кінець. Прощайте, карі оченята, в останній раз цілую вас. Прощайте, губи, губи малинові, в останній раз цілую вас. Прощайте, губи, губи малинові, в останній раз цілую вас. Червона ружа ще не зів'яла, вона й не думала зів'ять. Наша любов ще не пропала, вона повернеться назад. Наша любов ще не пропала, вона повернеться назад.
Thank you. We started with a polka, and now we're going to do a little waltz. If anybody wants to dance, please feel free.
Перелаз від сусіда до нас. Сусідський легіню, чом ти не йдеш до нас? Сусідський легіню, чом ти не йдеш до нас? До тебе ходити, треба тя любити. Я хлопець молодий, не дамся зганьбити. я хлопець молодий, не дамся зганьбити. Дівча було файне, не було їй пари. За нею хлопці йшли, як дощові хмари. За нею хлопці йшли, як дощові хмари. Перелаз від сусіда до нас. Сусідський легеню, чом ти не йдеш до нас? Сусідський легеню, чом ти не йдеш до нас?
Thank you.
Okay, now we're gonna change it up a little bit, and another song that is very close to Ukrainian hearts all over the world, especially in these days, Italian song of the partisans. Mila.
Una mattina mi son svegliata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi son svegliata e ho trovato l'invasore, oh partigiano, dammi via. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Una mattina mi son svegliata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi son svegliata e ho trovato l'invasore, un partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Se io muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E se io muoio da partigiano, tu mi devi seppellire lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E seppellire lassù in montagna sotto l'ombra di un bel fiore. Delle genti che passeranno, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Tutte le genti che passeranno mi diranno che bel fiore. Questo è il fiore di partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E questo è il fiore di partigiano, morto per la libertà. Morto per la
and now we're gonna take it way folk number that we love to do. It's a kolomika dance. Kolomika means circle. So imagine a lot of people dancing. Usually that's how our performances end up. Thank you. This next song that we're going to sing was written more than 100 years ago, and unfortunately it is still relevant. It was written during the time of independent Ukraine in the 1920s, and it's dedicated to the people that are fighting for the freedom of Ukraine. And unfortunately this year the song has gotten a second life, third life, and we'd like to dedicate the song to everybody who is fighting for the freedom of Ukraine. Thank you.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну ей розвеселимо. Марширують наші добровольці у кривавий танк, визволяти братів українців з московських кайдан. А ми ті московські кайдани розірвемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей розвеселимо. кайдани розірвемо, а ми нашу славну країну, гей, розвеселимо. Не хилися, червона калино, маєш білий цвіт. Не журися, славна Україно, маєш вільний рід. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Glory to Ukraine. Слава Україні. Урвалася струна, що найліпше гула. Віддалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Віддалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Урвалася струна, що найліпше гула. Видалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Віддалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ми міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ми міла потичком. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ти міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ти міла потичком. А ми тую струну зв'яжеме, зв'яжеме, а ми нашу файну дівку до вас не пошлеме, а ми нашу файну дівку до вас не пошлеме. Весіля, весіля, на весілі люди, ви проводьме, молодята, а родина будьме. Ви проводьме, молодята, а родина будьме. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ти міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ми міла поточком. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ти міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ми міла поточком. Урвалася струна, що найліпше гула. Віддалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Віддалася та дівка, що найкраща била. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ти міла подвигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ти міла поточком. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ми міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ми міла поточком. Гей, краєм, краєм, коню краєм, а ми міла подмигаєм. Гей, крочком, крочком, коню крочком, а ти міла поточком.
Okay, this next one you may recognize as a famous medley of Jewish tunes, and surprise, surprise, a lot of them originated in Ukraine, where there was a huge Jewish population. And again, it's a medley of cultures, and we are proud and love to play this song. This is one of our favorite. And again, usually there's like a big circle of people dancing. I know this is probably not the best avenue for this, but if you see us playing anywhere, come on out and you will learn some circle dances.
Nagila kamba, nagila kamba, nagila bezguka. Kamba, nagila kamba, nagila kamba, nagila bezguka. Kamba neramena, kamba neramena, kamba neramena bezguka. Kamba neramena, kamba neramena, kamba neramena bezguka. Urrakiba sameya, urrakiba sameya, urrakiba sameya, urrakiba sameya, urrakiba.
Thank you. Thank you to Westminster Forum for having us. Big privilege. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the program.
The Ukrainian Village Band, aren't they awesome? Yeah. Well, that was a great warm-up for a conversation about war. We're grateful to the UVB, Ukrainian Village Band, for your work in our city and our neighborhood and the state in support of the Ukrainian community. Thank you. Greetings to you all. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister here at Westminster Presbyterian Church and moderator of today's forum with Chris Blattman. This is our fourth and final program in the forum's fall season on Healing Our House Divided. If you missed any of the previous programs this fall or haven't heard them this week on NPR, you can find them on our website. They're all archived there at westminsterforum.org. I'd like to take a moment and thank the media sponsors of today's program. MinnPost is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, reader-supported source of Minnesota news. Visit them at minnpost.com. And thanks as well to Sahan Journal, covering issues affecting Minnesota immigrants and communities of color. Learn more at sahanjournal.com. And of course, the Westminster Town Hall Forum is pleased to partner today, as we have for many, many years, with Minnesota Public Radio. This forum is being broadcast live on NPR stations statewide. That means that we're going to become a studio audience in a few minutes when they let me know that we're ready to roll live. It'd be helpful if we all silenced our cell phones so that they don't speak up in the studio as we're going through our program. Thank you for doing that. When I receive the signal from NPR that we are beginning the broadcast, I will introduce our guest speaker to you and to the radio audience. Dr. Blattman will speak for about 25 minutes. And then the second half of today's program, as is our custom at the forum, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Dr. Blattman will answer as many as possible. We'll send them forward on the cards that you received in the sanctuary here, and use that card to record a question or a comment, and we'll get those. The ushers will bring them forward, and we'll ask as many as we can. If you're watching online, we're glad you're joining us via the live stream today. You want to write your questions into the chat feature on the live stream video at any point, and we'll collect those and ask them as well. And of course, do I hear the bells? I love the bells. I'm going to pause for the bells. But we're going live, so I need to keep going. Breads and spreads after the forum today, as we always do. Westminster Hall out the door to your right, and Professor Blattman will be there if you'd like to have conversation with him. We also have a lot of books. Some of you received books as you came in, free books, and there are also books for sale. Chris Blattman has signed all of his books there, a couple hundred of them, and there are some, I guess, inventory books from former forums out there as well, which you may pick up in this area here. We're going to kind of park Professor Blattman by the book, so if you'd like to have conversation with him after the program, that'd be a good place to do that. And one last note before we begin, today is our final program of this fall season and of 2023. This month is a critically important time for our annual fundraising at the forum. People may not realize this, but the forum is largely supported by hundreds of donations of a variety of sizes from those who participate in coming to the forum or watching us online or archiving our forums. We have 40 plus years of archived forums. We are intending to open conversation again and again and again in our community about important issues that matter, and your support, your financial support, makes that happen. So we're grateful for any donations you want to give today or another time through our website at westminsterforum.org/donate. There are, I don't know if they're baskets or maybe offering plates, probably baskets, at the exits as you leave here if you'd like to leave a donation. Thank you for your support. We are about 2 minutes away from launch, I think, and want to just say a word about this space, and then we'll go into the quiet. People often ask about this sanctuary. It was built in 1897, and we moved here from 7th and Nicollet when our building there burned. You've seen the Mary Tyler Moore statue. Right behind it is a plaque on the wall that said Westminster Presbyterian Church was located there and burned in 1895, and we moved here in 1897 and built this beautiful room. And this is where we have hosted the forum now for 42 years. And it's been a big honor of mine to be part of this. And I see, did I see Tane? There's Tane. I want to introduce Tane Danger, the director of the forum. Tane makes all of this happen, and he also will be easily recognizable with the bow tie and the smile, recognizable out in the breads and spreads and elsewhere around if you would like to visit with Tane. We're always looking for good ideas for speakers, so if you have one, speak to Tane or to me afterwards. And now I think we're going to move into a time of silence and until I get the signal. Good afternoon and welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, where for more than 40 years we have invited speakers of conscience to address issues of the day from an ethical perspective. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm senior minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church, located in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I moderate the forum. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Chris Blattman, an internationally renowned economist and political scientist who studies global conflict, crime, and poverty. He's the Ramalee E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago's Pearson Institute and Harris School of Public Policy. He co-leads the university's Development Economics Center and directs the Obama Foundation Scholars Program. Much of his current work is on armed groups, gangs, organized crime, and the people who join violent organizations. His recent work has been in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the United States. He's a leader of the Crime and Violence Initiative for MIT's Poverty Action Lab, as well as the Peace and Recovery Program of the research NGO Innovations for Poverty Action. His new book, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace, draws on decades of economics, political science, and real-world interventions to lay out the root causes and the remedies for war. The book has been reviewed and recommended by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Economist, and the Washington Post. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Chris Blattman.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm an American now, but I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, and Minnesotans and Minneapolis has always felt the place that's most like home in the United States. So it's really nice to be here. You know, what I'm going to talk about today and the book, a lot of it's actually about my experiences. 20 years ago, through a series of accidents, found myself working in an active conflict in northern Uganda and East Africa. I started working in West Africa shortly afterwards, in the aftermath of conflict amidst ethnic and religious violence. Some years ago, I began working in Colombia on gang cartel violence. I began working in Mexico. And then, of course, when you move to Chicago, everybody says, why do you work on violence over there? You know, we have a violence problem here. And so 6 years ago, I also started working in Chicago. But even if it's a book that's partly about my experiences, I like to start by saying this is not actually a book about my ideas. This is a book born of frustration. The frustration because there are decades of work, things I learned 25 years ago and 20 years ago, and 15 years ago, and 10 years ago, and things that would just rotate my brain 90 degrees, and then rotate it again and rotate it again, because I think they were so powerful and they changed how I thought about violence and conflict. And so many of those ideas weren't out there. And so I wanted to sort of stack it together in one place for everyone else to sort of access this. So this is really me trying to boil down not just what my field has to say, but what every social science has to say, and also all of the lessons I've learned from all of these hardworking practitioner and these statesmen and stateswomen around the world. And I can't tell you all of that today, but so I'm going to try to focus just on 5 big messages, 5 big ideas, which if you remembered nothing else, hopefully you remember them. And the first of those is, most of the time we don't fight. Or as I like to say, enemies prefer to loathe one another in peace. And this seems like a strange thing to say at a moment when we feel like we're on the cusp of World War III, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, activity in the South China Sea, the looming possibility of a world war involving China. The number of civil wars active in the world right now is higher than it's ever been since the previous peak of the 1980s. And of course, homicides are spiking all across American and Latin American cities. So why does it feel like, why does that happen? Why does it feel like such a violent world? And one of the reasons is because we don't talk about the times when violence doesn't happen. Right? We don't pay attention to the dogs that don't bark. Now, one example came just 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if, like me, you accidentally scrolled 20 pages through your news app, past all of the Ukraine news, you stumbled upon a story that said, yesterday, India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan. And nothing happened. Calm ensued, as it has, not every day, but most days for the last few decades. Right? Now, if India and Pakistan had gone to war, right, we would be, the newspapers would be filled with these messages. We'd be reading about it every day. And of course, all of the causes would be obvious, right? The flawed leaders and the ancient hatreds and the poverty and all of the things that drive, we think, or people tell us, drive nations and peoples and groups to war. But India and Pakistan did not go to war that day. War would have been unimaginably ruinous. And so that day, like every day since and most days before, there's been peace. And so we're a little bit like emergency room doctors who only ever pay attention to the critically ill and forget that most of humanity is healthy, and our natural state is health, and most of us get better, and maybe most of us don't end up in critical care in the first place. Now, fortunately, doctors don't make that mistake. Doctors spend their entire life in training focused mostly on human health, and every trial and every vaccine and everything they do is focused on comparing the healthy to the sick, and they know that the sick are exceptional, right? And we don't do that when we think about violence. We don't do it enough. And that leads to 2 big problems. Okay, the first problem is we get demoralized, right? And you start to hear things like the natural state of humanity is violence, or there's never been a time when we're not at war, which in some sense is true, but forgets that actually most rivals are loathing one another in peace. But that's not the big mistake. The second and biggest mistake is that when you only start with the conflicts that are happening, right? Just if you only focused on the sick people and you traced back what makes them sick without ever comparing them to the healthy, you'd get the diagnosis all wrong. And then your treatments would be equally rotten. All right, so if you trace back from the conflicts that happen, you find these ancient hatreds and these flawed leaders and assassinations of archdukes and this and that. And the problem is when you actually go to the conflicts that didn't happen, right, and you trace back, you also find the ancient hatreds and the poverty and the flawed leaders and these idiosyncratic events like assassinations and insults. And so these aren't irrelevant, but these are probably not the things that caused war. So we all have to become a little bit more like doctors. Okay, and the first thing we have to realize is, and this is the second big message, is the reason we don't fight is because it's so costly. War is ruinous. It's the worst way to settle our differences. Okay, I want you to imagine two parties. Maybe they're fighting over a territory. Maybe they're fighting over a parliament. Maybe they're fighting over a resource. Maybe they're fighting over a drug corner. Maybe they're fighting over some issue. And they face a choice, right? Suppose they're evenly matched. They can say, look, we can either split the difference on this, or we can destroy a share of the thing we're fighting over, and then one of us flips a coin and gets that destroyed and shrunken pie. Okay? And that's the choice they face. And that's the powerful incentive towards peace, because you can almost always find a split. You can almost always split the difference of a whole pie rather than flipping a coin for a shrunken and damaged one. The costs of war are like a peace bonus that both sides get to divide if they can find another way to settle their differences. And most of the time, not all of the time, most of the time, they do. Now, I did not write a book called Why We Don't Fight. I wrote a book called Why We Fight, because obviously we do. Just like emergency room doctors have to pay attention to the critically ill. We have to devote lots of attention to them. So why do we fight? Well, the reason this perspective is so important, that most of the time we don't fight, and we don't fight because it's costly, is because, and this is the third big message, and if you remembered one thing from today or one thing from the book, remember this, which is every time we fight, it's because our leaders or our society either overlooked those costs of war or were willing to pay them. And as it happens, there's 5 main ways this occurs. Now, when you write a book and you say to your editor, there's 5 causes of war, she's like, could you do it in 3? And your response is, listen, I just took all of decades of social science, practical lessons of practitioners, boiling it all down. I got it down to 5. She's like, how about 4? Stuck to my guns, I'm sorry, there's 5. It's a lot to take in. So this is why there's a book. But at the end of the day, remember that they all have this thing in common, right? And so why do we ignore, or why are we willing to pay the costs of war? Well, it's either because our leaders are unchecked and can ignore a lot of those costs and don't have to pay them. They're ideological, or our societies are ideological, and so they're willing to pay those costs for some ethereal goal because they're biased in some way and ignoring or underestimating those costs, because they're uncertain about those costs, or because they're unreliable. All right, and I want to walk you through those 5, unchecked, ideological, biased, uncertain, and unreliable, through, I think, the example that is on so many people's minds this year, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, first, even this is an example of why most enemies prefer to loathe in peace, because Vladimir Putin and his regime have spent the last 20 years trying to co-opt the politics of Ukraine without resorting to invasion. There's been propaganda, dirty money, support for separatists, assassinations, poisonings, right? War was a last resort. And meanwhile, Russia, like most empires, has sought to dominate and co-opt the politics of its neighbors with as little violence as possible, and it succeeded. There's no set of newspaper stories about Russia's invasion of Belarus and the brief incursion of quote-unquote peacekeepers into Kazakhstan, flitted through the newspapers very quickly, because those nations, in some sense, consented to this domination. A tyrannical superpower that seemed to be more powerful to them said, we're not evenly powered. I don't want an even split of the pie. I have 80 or 90% of the power. I want 80 or 90% of the pie. And like most people in most of history around the world, they acquiesced. And that's the sad thing. There's nothing just about peace necessarily. Right? Peace often means the powerful get their, quote unquote, what they deserve. But Ukrainians said, no way. So why did Russia choose to invade? unchecked leaders, a personalized dictator who is insulated from most of the costs. He doesn't have to pay most of those costs of war, so why weigh them in his calculus? What's more, when leaders, particularly autocratic leaders, think that their regime is more likely to be preserved by going to war, even if it's against the interests of their group, now they suddenly have a private incentive to ignore those costs and pay them and go to war. And that's actually one of the most common drivers of conflict in all of human history. Ideology. Every story you hear about a regime that is obsessed with getting the empire back together, or Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation, or some grander vision of a return to true superpower status, right? Whether or not any of these things are true, no one is talking to Vladimir Putin. No one actually. Everything you read in the newspaper is speculation. But those are all stories of a regime pursuing an ideological goal that's not part of the material pie that they're fighting over, but something worth fighting for, something that only violence can deliver. All right? So we're at unchecked and ideological, and then we get to biased. And you've heard this story too. This is the story you hear in the newspapers most often: an isolated, insulated leader who got bad information, who underestimated the costs and difficulty of this, right? A charge also levied against the Bush administration in its initial invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and against every American president since in their assessments of whether or not to withdraw or surge. Okay, and this is a classic problem of bureaucracies, especially of autocrats, who get insulated from hearing bad news. And that's a story of bias. That's a story of underestimating the costs and difficulty, and so getting that basic calculus wrong. The fourth, which is uncertainty, is not one you read about in the newspaper. It's maybe one of the most important for this conflict, but nobody talks about it. It's a little more subtle, right? But everybody understands that it's a strategic reason, and you all understand it without me having to teach you game theory if you've ever played a game of poker. It starts from remembering just 1 year ago how uncertain so many things are. How powerful was Russia and its army? How plucky and resolved would the Ukrainians be? And how unified would the West be on something like sanctions? And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three of these things was always within the realm of possibility, but nobody predicted it. Nobody. Not one expert, and certainly not Vladimir Putin. Okay, and so in that circumstance, surely because of the uncertainty and the noise, and not the fog of war, but the fog of planning a war, right? War becomes a gamble. But here's where the strategic thing comes in. Here's where the poker comes in, right? Because you don't know what hand your opponent has, right? The Ukrainians in the West can say, no, 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 we are resolved, we're plucky, we are unified, we will stand up to you. And you know, you called their bluff in Syria, and you called their bluff on Crimea, and this is probably just a bluff again, right? And on the other hand, the other side looks across and says, well, he's arming those troops, massing those troops, surely that's a bluff. It would be lunacy to invade, all right? And so in poker, you know that when your opponent's bluffing, right, your optimal strategy is not to fold all the time. And your optimal strategy is not to call all the time. That would be a terrible strategy. And facing that, you also know that your optimal strategy is never to bluff all of the time, and it's not to bluff none of the time, right? Strategically, amidst this uncertainty, war becomes a gamble, because the strategically optimal thing to do is to invade some of the time, unpredictably. And this drives a tremendous amount of conflict, and if we don't talk about it, if we don't diagnose it right, we're not going to recommend the right treatments. Okay, the last and the fifth is this unreliability, or what political scientists and economists call a commitment problem. And it's basically when you don't trust your opponent to stick to a deal. We could make a deal, we could cut that deal, but I don't trust you to keep it. And that's what's happening on both sides to this day. No one trusts Vladimir Putin, if there's a ceasefire, not to regroup and attack again. And Russia doesn't trust any Ukrainian leader who could come up with a deal, because they know they'd be tossed out of office and that deal would be rejected right away. So there's a deep commitment problem, right? That has either side, you know that they have strategic incentives to renege. And those are also at the root of so many of the longest wars in history, including World War I, World War II, and the US invasion of Iraq, obviously. And the book is really about helping us recognize these, because I think we're good at recognizing the bias and we're good at recognizing ideology, but we tend to miss, I think, the other three more strategic ones, which are the unchecked leaders, the uncertainty, and the commitment problems. Now, the book is actually about lots of different kinds of war, because my day job is not great power politics. My day job is understanding why gangs are fighting, understanding why ethnic groups are fighting, understanding why civil war factions are fighting, and figuring out what we can do to get them back to loathing one another in peace. And these 5 work at all levels. So let me give you an example from Chicago, which is experiencing a huge homicide spike, as many of you know. There's a few stories you hear. You hear the story of ideology, or actually what I would call vengeance, right? Young men who are willing to shoot, not irrationally, but because they're getting something. They're willing to pay the cost of violence because they're angry about a father or an uncle or a brother, or maybe somebody shot at them, right? The second story you hear, which is also true, are young men who are biased, who are emotional, hot, reactive, in-the-moment decisions that they later regret. The third story you don't hear so much, and again, it's the story of uncertainty. One of the young men I work with, he's the leader of a gang. He's in our program. He wants to get out, but he talks about how when he started, he says, here's how I became a killer. Somebody robbed us. You know, we started selling drugs, and they stole our drugs. And I knew that if we didn't do something about that, then we were going to get killed or robbed again and again, or we'd have to get out of this business. I had to establish a reputation. I had to show them what I was made of. And so we had to kill, and we killed again, and we killed again. And after a while, we had to do it occasionally, but people left us alone. Now, you don't need a reputation in a world of certainty. You only need a reputation when your resolve and your strength is uncertain. Right? If his resolve had been written on his forehead, they never would have robbed him in the first place if they'd known what he was going to do. And it's as if you're playing that game of bluffing and poker, but now it's more complicated because every other person you're ever going to play poker with is standing around watching how you're going to react, and that increases your incentive to call or attack. Okay, and so we need to pay attention to these strategic routes. It drives an awful lot of violence. And when I say these 5 operate at all levels of conflict, I really mean it, not just because I can use them to explain gang violence and the war in Ukraine. It's because those exact same 3 reasons why these young men are shooting each other in the streets of Chicago, I think of as the exact same reasons the United States went into Afghanistan, and more importantly, why we stayed for 20 years. There was vengeance. Right? There was a desire for retribution, a desire to pay a certain number of costs. 100 American lives per year, 0.5% of GDP, that was the cost of the war, at least to the American side. Price willing to pay to agree for vengeance. There was bias, intelligence failures, insulation from the truth, consistently over-optimistic expectations about what would happen, underestimating the costs, right? Just like what's happening on the streets of Chicago. But most importantly, there was reputation. Because every time someone thought about not invading Afghanistan or leaving when the fight got tough, they didn't say, oh no, what are the Taliban going to think? They said, well, what are the Russians going to think? What are the Chinese going to think? What are the Iranians going to think? What is ISIS going to think? What message will we send to some other terror group? Right? They were concerned about their reputation. In a world where American resolve was uncertain, they needed to prove what would happen if you attacked the Americans on American soil. All right, and so this was a story, not fundamentally to me about vengeance or bias, but fundamentally about reputation. And you can find that as strategic or as repugnant as the calculus of that Chicago drug dealer, but you need to understand it. Otherwise, you're going to get the diagnosis wrong, you're going to get the treatment wrong. Okay, so the fifth and last message of the book is how do we get to peace? And that's really the last half. And I can't tell you all those paths to peace in this short time we have. What I can tell you, and this is the fifth big message of the book, is every path to peace is tackling one of those five. Right? And if it's not tackling one of those five, then it's probably not a path to peace. And I could talk about a lot of ways this happened. I could talk about the ways that our social integration, our economic integration, our ideological integration, our ideas of human rights have been peacemaking. I could talk about the expansion of a rules-based order, not just at the international level, but within states, the growth of community, the growth of social norms, and how that's controlled violence. I could talk about international mediators and peacekeepers, and why when they work because they're tackling one or more of the five. But I'd rather tell you about a group of less conventional peacekeepers that you might not have heard about. And these are the gangs of Medellin. The last 6 years I've been also working in Colombia's second city, its industrial and commercial heartland. Beautiful, rich, prosperous city that also happens to be completely controlled in every one of its low and middle income neighborhoods by a street gang known as a combo. And despite being filled to the green peaks surrounding this city with hot-headed, armed young men, Medellin is one of the most peaceful, large metropolises on the continent. And why is that? Well, a lot of our work has been collecting data, but also talking to a lot of the leaders. One of them I met in prison told me a story that I think encapsulates this very well. And he talks about an argument that broke out over a game of billiards in the game room. And he doesn't remember why the fight broke out. What he does remember is that afterwards one side pulled out their guns and fired on the other side. Now, if you want to understand why they're carrying guns in a Medellin prison, you'll have to invite me back for another lecture, for another day. Needless to say, when the dust settled, 23 were injured miraculously, no one was killed. But as you can imagine, there was a cycle of retaliatory killings that not only happened within the prison, but spilled out onto the outside where these gangs actually have their major territory. But what didn't happen, and actually what did happen is every gang in the city lined up behind one side or the other and they prepared for a war. And when Medellin has gone to war, and it has gone to war on 2 major occasions in the last 30 years, it has become the most violent place on the planet, 5 times, 10 times more violent than Ukraine and Russia right now. But it didn't. It ended there. And it ended for a few reasons. One was that gangs prefer to loathe one another in peace. Right? They don't want to fight over these drug corners. They'd rather find another way. But most importantly, there's a shadowy set of peacemakers who lose a lot of money in a drug fight, right? They're the wholesale sellers of drugs to these retail drug operations. Nobody buys crack in a gunfight. No one pays extortion. And they lose a lot of money. What's more, the government puts these mafia bosses in jail because they're big and identifiable when there's a gang war. And they don't like that either. That's why they were in jail and we were able to talk to them. And so they've spent years building peace. If the young, hot-headed gang leaders are unchecked, vengeant, biased, and underestimating cost, well, they have a whole set of tools, sanctions, sometimes at the point of a gun. If they're uncertain, well, they sit them down at something called la mesa, the table, to bargain it out, exchange information. And if they have a commitment problem, if they're unreliable, well, they will provide commitment. They've created an organization called La Oficina, the office, and they will hold. They're the third-party guarantor to these peace deals. And so the homicide rate in Medellin is about 1/3 or 1/4 of the homicide rate of a lot of America's largest cities today. Now, I like to talk about Medellin because it's actually a metaphor for our world. Instead of several hundred fractious combos, we have several hundred fractious countries. But we're not several hundred fractious countries fighting. We're a set of confederations led by hegemonic, head honcho mafias. One of them is led by the United States in this hemisphere, another by the EU, another by Russia, another by China. And they have sanctions and peacekeepers and troops and things to keep the little combos in line. And they've built a mesa, and they have mediators that step in to exchange information. And they have an officina, we call it the UN Security Council, that tries to hold countries to their deals. And like Medellin, this isn't a system that's equal, it's not democratic, it's imperfectly applied, it's often unjust, but to the extent it works because it's tackling these five. Now, I hate to end on the inspirational note that our international system resembles organized crime. It does. It works a little, but maybe the message is it could do better, right? We can do better. We have done better. This is better than what Medellin had 20 years ago, and this is better than what we had 75 years ago. All right, but we can do a lot better. And I certainly hope we will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris Blattman. This is the Westminster Town Hall Forum, coming to you from Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. I'm Tim Hart Anderson, Senior Minister at Westminster Presbyterian and moderator of the forum. Our speaker today is Dr. Chris Blattman. While the ushers collect questions from the in-house audience, I'd like to thank our broadcast partner, Minnesota Public Radio News, who's broadcasting today's program live. Thanks as well to our other media partners, MinnPost and Sahan Journal. This is the last talk in our fall season on Healing Our House Divided. If you missed any of our previous talks, you can watch or listen to them at our website, westminsterforum.org. There you can hear our programs with Jonathan Reckford of Habitat for Humanity International, Lisa Pruitt on the rural-urban rift, and my conversation with former Attorney General Eric Holder. They're all available at westminsterforum.org. And now, if you're ready, Dr. Blattman, I will present the questions from the audience. At the start of your comments, you mentioned all of us are concerned about World War III breaking out, and then you just kind of left that on the table and went on to tell us about your academic work, which is really interesting. But could we go back to that point? You have a scholar, a student of wars. How likely are we on the verge of World War III, in your view?
So I think 20 odd years ago, I was sitting in an audience like you are here, and there's a group of eminent macroeconomists on stage. And somebody asked them, what's the risk in the United States of an Argentina-style financial meltdown? And to a person they said, look, trivial, very, very low. But for the first time in my life, the answer isn't zero, and that's terrifying. And so that's a little bit about how I feel about World War III. Less likely with Russia, maybe more an escalating conflict with China over an invasion of Taiwan. I think it's extremely unlikely, but I think it's maybe more, it's suddenly imaginable, and that's terrifying.
And what can we learn from China's observation of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and vis-a-vis their interest in Taiwan?
Well, I mean, I think what China's reluctance and failure to actually engage in any real overt hostilities and an actual invasion is a message here. They're loathing one another in peace. They're all striving for decades, hoping for a peaceful resolution and hoping that this thing kind of works itself out without an invasion. So when I think about what could go wrong, what could lead one side or the other to ignore, overlook, or be more willing to pay these costs, I'm worried about a few things. I'm worried, number one, that China has been moving from a widely, very institutionalized autocracy where there are many checks and balances to one that is much more personalized, right? Over the last 20 years, Putin took Russia from a fairly institutionalized autocracy with some democratic accountability to a personalized dictatorship. Xi Jinping is trying to do the same thing, it seems, in in China. That's profoundly risky because it means he's ignoring more of the costs. And if he sees an invasion as regime preserving, then that's a danger. And then there's ideology, and this is on both sides. There seems to be a very deep ideological commitment, not just in the Chinese leadership and the Chinese populace, that Taiwan is part of China and they are willing to pay some price to keep it in. And the Taiwanese, and even America in particular, seem very ideologically committed to defending the liberty and the freedom, right? It's just like the American Revolution. A tyrannical superpower offered the 13 colonies semi-sovereignty. Canada accepted that deal. Most of the British Empire accepted that deal. It was just the exception. It was these group of revolutionaries with an idea of liberty and rights, a rather novel one that said no way, and they decided to fight, even against the odds. And so that's the story of an awful lot of these wars. That's also the story of Ukraine, right? They said no way, not against the odds in some ways, against expectations, and refused this deal of semi-sovereignty. And so it's this democratic, idealistic, liberal ideology, which I admire and share, that I think is growing ever stronger and is so much at the heart of so many wars. And that is why I could imagine this World War III happening.
You are speaking on the day after our nation marked the anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor, when our nation at the time perceived that as a direct attack on us, which happened in Ukraine. You did not cite defense of one's home as a cause for war. Why not?
So it's interesting. So my grandfather in 1939 was 16 years old. He and all the kids in his village, this little tiny place called Vankley Kill, which probably doesn't even exist on a map, went to the recruiting office, signed up. And the recruiting officer said, you guys, all you 18-year-olds, let's go, but you, and he pointed to my grandfather, Jim, come back in a couple years. And without saying a word, they all stood up and they walked out. And he said, whoa, 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 whoa. All right, and he scribbled on, and that's how my grandfather technically became a child soldier. And went on to fight in Italy. That didn't happen in the United States, right? Actually, the United States followed exactly what I said happens most of the time in our book, as they said, we'd rather loathe one another in peace. And for 2 years, they didn't go to war. Why? Because war was too ruinous, it was costly. And it was only when, historians are fond of saying only two nations declared war on Germany without being attacked, France and Britain, at which point the Canadians say, well, actually, us too. But that's true. Most of the world stood by, just like much of the world is standing by and not getting behind the EU and the US in this conflict. And they're saying, you know what, it's not our business. And so it was only when an ideological, unchecked leader with an apparent commitment problem and misjudging, amidst the uncertainty, misjudging the consequences of attacking the United States, pulled this country kicking and screaming into war. And so we don't remember the war because it was nobly fought, and the war was won because of the United States. And there were a lot of people who wanted to go in, but it does remember most people prefer to loathe one another in peace.
One of our questions is provoking a little bit. I think your sufficient analysis of every conflict by your 5 reasons.
Not my 5 reasons.
Okay.
Everybody's
Are there
5
places in the world that challenge this framework, anywhere where the 5 reasons haven't really stood up as a way to understand a particular conflict?
So certainly, I mean, any kind of oversimplification, trying to squeeze everything into 5 logics. I think the reason most of it fits is this isn't sort of this isn't me saying my theory's right, my book's right, the other books are wrong. You can think of this as a way to just sort of organize. There's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, and it's overwhelming. And so it's almost like a typology. So a typology, or a way to classify and understand, is supposed to be universal. But if I had to say what's missing not to the 101 level, the 201 level. One of the tricky things is not when you have two people, when you have two countries, two gangs fighting, that logic I told you about it's much better to loathe one another in peace, that strategic incentive not to go to war, that actually erodes. Once you have 3 or 4 or 5, let alone 50 organizations, then suddenly, as a game theorist, you'd say peace is no longer the equilibrium. Not necessarily. And so it's a set of conflicts. When I think of the Eastern Congo, when I think of some periods of time in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when I think of some eras of European war, when there are many actors, right? This is in some sense something that doesn't fit in. And it's important because it's one reason why, if you're a mediator, if you're a senator or a parliamentarian or a concerned citizen or something from somewhere, and you encounter this, what is the first thing you try to do? You try to organize these myriad camps into 2 parties that can bilaterally negotiate, because that's the most stable thing. So one of the least stable things that happens, that maybe in retrospect I wished I'd talked more about in the book, are all of these conflicts where you have these many actors, the streets of Chicago, the east of Congo, and so forth, that just seem to never really resolve.
The next question has to do with the availability of the weapons of war, whether they're guns that are used on the streets of Chicago or the weapons produced by our extraordinarily large defense budget, the military-industrial complex. To what extent does availability of the weapons of war influence decisions about going to war?
So the big one is, the bigger the guns, the more costly the war is going to be. The more costly the war is going to be, the bigger the peace bonus you get to split. And so in theory, the costliness of war is an incentive to loathe one another in peace. And that's often true, nuclear weapons being the chief example. The problem with that is, of course, sometimes we can still go to war, and so what happens is when you have more and bigger guns, wars might be less likely and less frequent, but when they happen, they're a doozy. And maybe the only exception to that is, and the only time when that's not true is, in my own opinion, with handguns and other weapons with individuals, right? I've been talking about groups. I haven't been talking about individuals. And I think in the hands of individuals, when I think a lot of hot reactive emotions come into play, right? Hot reactive emotions don't necessarily explain why one country invades another day after day after day for several years, or why one ethnic group attacks another. It's not irrelevant, but it's not in the top set. But when it comes to individuals making decisions, that availability of weapons, whether I think it's for killing themselves, which is an endemic problem, or shooting someone else in a moment of anger is a real issue. I don't think we should extend that. That's not the logic of how it works at the international level. It's in theory, it's a deterrent. It's a costly deterrent, but it's a risky deterrent. But in principle, it's a deterrent.
Does the process of ending a conflict that has already broken out into violence differ from preventing war from starting in the first place?
I think there's a lot of echoes of the 5. Let's take this war with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The uncheckedness, the fact that Putin's a personalized dictator, he's actually staked his regime on this war. So often once autocrats start war, they find it difficult to stop. They have a disincentive because they worry about the preservation of their regime. And so this uncheckedness can contribute to a lot of long wars. Ideologies, this doesn't always happen. Usually that incredible conflict and the violence and the horror is enough to make most enemies settle in peace. Most people don't know this. Most of the time we don't fight, and when we do fight, we fight briefly. The average war in the last 200 years is about 3 months long. All right? But occasionally those ideologies and those feelings harden, right? And that intransigence gets worse rather than better. And I think, and it's hard to say why that happens, but this is an example of it happening. And then the third thing I would say is usually the uncertainties resolve pretty fast, and the bias resolves pretty fast, and it did. But what's, I think, striking about this war is actually just how many things remain uncertain, because no one's quite sure how European resolve will last through the winter, or Ukrainian resolve. No one's quite sure what the Russian mobilization is going to do. No one's quite sure if Ukraine has exhausted its offensive advantages or is just getting started. And so this persistent uncertainty in this war, I think, is another reason for this one continuing.
In your comments, you suggested that the UN or another international body could do better. What did you mean by that? How could they do better?
So let's take an example of sanctions. In principle, right, this is the way our justice system or any group in any country in the world that decided it wanted to take over the government, there's a pretty predictable set of consequences for doing this. And in a country with a rule of law, you know that in advance, and it's going to be applied somewhat blindly. And we don't have that in the international system, right? We have a set of sanctions that were implemented against Russia, but it was pretty unpredictable, really hard to calculate. They weren't sure it was going to happen. Still not clear who's buying in for how long. So we don't really have a calculable rules-based order that people know what to expect. And that's just adding to the uncertainty, and that's undermining the effectiveness of sort of predictable punishments and consequences. That's just one example. I can talk about uncertainty and how we have imperfect institutions for resolving that, and how the dysfunction of the UN Security Council really undermines their ability to be a third-party guarantor. But we have been getting better. I think every decade has seen progress on one of these fronts. I think International Criminal Court is a good example. And so, step by step, marginal improvements, year by year, decade by decade. We've been moving in the right direction. I'd like to see us keep moving.
There are students here from the Humphrey School, and one of them has sent this question forward. When is it favorable, if ever, to go to war?
Well, I think it comes down to this idea of first of all, when you're facing an adversary who is unchecked and ideological, and in some sense is going to bring you into war whether you like it or not, and some would use World War II as an example. I think, but this idea I raised earlier that some principles are worth fighting for. Right now, everybody differs on those principles, right? Sometimes we all think our own principles are noble. Liberty, self-determination, sovereignty are ones I would fight for. Ethno-nationalism or religious supremacy are ones that others would fight for. And I think it's right in our own minds when we're fighting based on these principles. Otherwise, I think in every situation, it's always strategically the worst way to settle our differences.
Most conventional wars have a beginning and an ending. The war on terror, was that a mistake to use that kind of nomenclature in our engagement with a different sort of enemy?
The war on terror is a little bit like the war on drugs. Again, let's go back to ideology. This is our ideological war. Why not settle with the cartels? Why not make concessions to a group that's using terror? We refuse to do so. It would be a lot less costly, certainly with the cartels. Let them do their business. A lot of countries, mostly autocracies, cut those deals with drug cartels and terrorists all the time. We don't do that, and we fight these forever wars because we refuse to do so on principle, right? Might also be strategically unwise, but for the most part, we do so because the idea is repugnant, maybe as it should be. And so I think we need to understand that. We're fighting because we're willing to pay the costs based on some principles. And I think that is why when I look to the next century, when I think about these wars against tyranny and these wars against drugs and these wars against terror, these are wars fought by democracies, not only because of principles, but primarily we're talking about our own ideals or ideologies and principles.
What about the Jewish, Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian conflicts in the Middle East? Do your 5 categories apply to the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
So first of all, the dispute between Palestinians and Israelis has been going on for about 100 years now. And only about, now, of course, every single one of those years has been violent to some degree, but most of that violence has been relatively very low scale. There's probably only been about 15 or 20 years of extreme violence, and all of those episodes of violence are often just a few weeks long, with a few obvious exceptions. So to begin, Israelis and Palestinians are almost an example of 2 rivals who prefer to loathe in peace most of the time, except, of course, when they don't. And why they don't is a long conversation, but I think one of the most powerful, I think at least talked about explanations. There's a wonderful book by a political scientist named Wendy Pearlman at Northwestern University, and she looks at both sides and she says, look, what separated, she's one of these few people who's pointed out most of the time they don't fight. What separates these 15 or 20 years from those other years? She says, well, an awful lot of them are times when one side or the other lost control of their own side, and splinter groups and factions ignited violence for their own unchecked or ideological reasons. And so I think there's a strong argument that one of the things that ignites this from being a tense sort of set of brinksmanship into actual violence has been a problem of unchecked and ideological, not top leaders, but middle leaders, these splinter groups and these factions that have helped escalate both sides into war until after a few weeks they can get a handle on them.
We have time for one last question. Most of what you've been speaking about are institutional or state actors in the either participation in or prevention of war. What can individual citizens do as individuals to help promote peace?
So it's a great question, because that's actually what I struggled with. It's really hard to end a book. A lot of books fail in the last chapter, right? A lot of books on war and violence and saying, here's, everything's getting better, right? Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, excellent book. Everything's getting better. My friend Bill Easterly, who's a development economist, his books always end, things are getting worse, there's nothing we can do about it. And then others say, now that I've explained the 5 causes of war, here's your 10-step plan to peace, just follow my rules. And that's not true either. And none of them help us understand what can we do. So I actually decided just to teach a class about this. For 3 years, I decided to read everything I could, not just about conflict, but how do we solve these big world problems? What do the scientists who study this tell us about how social change has actually happened? And the answer in every single case, not whether it's conflict, poverty, agriculture, finance, every single answer has been step by step. Piecemeal. Karl Popper called it being the piecemeal engineer. And so I titled my last chapter, I made a little dad joke. It's piecemeal, spelled P-E-A-C-E, meal. And it's about it's about how presidents and prime ministers and mayors and gang leaders and rebel leaders and people like you and me make these changes piece by piece. And every step has happened that way. It's about just sort of thinking on the margin about what can I do in my community or with my vote or with my voice to actually just advance this a little bit. And for me, the answer was actually trying to change the conversation, right? That's why you write a book. At the end of the day, you write a book because you want to try to change the way people talk about a subject. That was my little piecemeal contribution. And so my advice to everyone is find that little margin in your community or your church or your city or your country where you can do that little thing on the margin. And so it's find your inner piecemeal engineer.
It's a good place to end. Thank you, Chris Blattman, for joining us at the Westminster Town Hall Forum.
Thank you.
Dr. Blattman will be available for conversation out near the books. They're breads and spreads, or is it spreads and beds? I don't know. But the Westminster Town Hall Forum will invite you to join us in Westminster Hall to your right, and we'll see you in the next season of the Town Hall Forum. Thanks for being here today.